The press conference was supposed to focus on Ronaldo's upcoming Champions League match and his team's preparation strategy. But when a Palestinian journalist in the back row raised her hand to ask about his recent statements supporting Palestinian rights, the atmosphere in the room immediately shifted from routine sports journalism to something far more significant. As other reporters turned to see who had dared to introduce political topics into what was supposed to be a carefully controlled promotional event. And when the moderator attempted to redirect the conversation back to football tactics and player fitness, Ronaldo himself intervened to insist that the journalist be allowed to ask her question because he had learned that silencing Palestinian voices was part of the systematic oppression that prevented their stories from reaching international audiences who might otherwise understand the human cost of policies that were often discussed in abstract political terms, rather than through the experiences of real people whose lives were affected by decisions made by governments they had no power to influence. The journalist who had asked the question was named Lila, a correspondent for a small independent media outlet who had been covering sports as well as political stories, because Palestinian journalists were often forced to accept whatever assignments were available, rather than specializing in single topics. And her presence at the press conference represented both her professional dedication and the broader challenges faced by Palestinian media professionals who struggled to gain access to international events while working under conditions that included restrictions on movement, limited resources, and the constant threat of retaliation for reporting stories that challenged official narratives about conflicts and policies that affected civilian populations throughout occupied territories where journalism was treated as potential security threat rather than essential public service. When Layla was finally permitted to ask her question, she did so with the kind of careful professionalism that characterized journalists who had learned to navigate hostile environments where their questions might be dismissed, their credentials might be questioned, and their right to participate in international media events might be challenged by people who preferred that Palestinian perspectives remain absent from conversations about Middle Eastern politics and sports diplomacy that was often used to normalize relationships while ignoring underlying injustices that continued to affect millions of people whose voices were systematically excluded from platforms where their stories might generate sympathy and pressure for policy changes. Her question was direct and thoughtful, asking Ronaldo whether he understood the risks that Palestinian journalists faced when covering sports events and political stories, and whether he would consider using his platform to advocate for press freedom and journalist safety in regions where media professionals were targeted for harassment, imprisonment, and violence simply for doing their jobs in ways that documented human rights violations and civilian suffering that some governments preferred to keep hidden from international scrutiny, that might generate criticism and demands for accountability from institutions that claimed to support democratic values, including freedom of press and expression. Ronaldo's response was immediate and emphatic, demonstrating that he had given considerable thought to these issues and understood the connections between his own platform and the broader struggle for human rights that included protection for journalists whose work was essential for informing international audiences about conditions and events that might otherwise remain invisible to people who had the power to influence policy changes through public pressure and diplomatic initiatives that could address systematic problems rather than just managing their symptoms through humanitarian aid that provided temporary relief without changing underlying structures that created ongoing crises. Palestinian journalists face dangers that most of us cannot imagine, Ronaldo said, his voice carrying clearly through the press room where other reporters were now paying attention to topics they rarely covered in sports journalism contexts. They are targeted for reporting truth about conditions in their communities. They are prevented from traveling to cover stories that matter to their audiences. And they are often excluded from international events where their perspectives could help people understand what is really happening in Palestine, rather than just accepting official versions that ignore civilian suffering and human rights violations that continue because the world is not paying attention to voices that could change public understanding if they were allowed to speak. The response from other journalists in the room revealed both support and discomfort, with some reporters expressing appreciation for Ronaldo's willingness to address press freedom issues, while others seemed concerned about the political implications of discussing Palestinian journalism in a sports context, where such topics were typically avoided to prevent controversy that might complicate relationships between sports organizations and governments, that preferred to separate athletic competition from political discussions that could generate negative publicity or diplomatic complications for institutions that benefited from maintaining neutral stances on controversial international issues. The follow-up questions that emerged focused on whether athletes had responsibilities to speak about political issues, whether sports events should be platforms for discussing human rights, and whether Ronaldo's support for Palestinian journalists might affect his relationships with sponsors or sports organizations that preferred their athletes to avoid controversial topics. But his responses made clear that he viewed press freedom as a fundamental human rights issue rather than a political position, and that supporting journalists' right to work safely and report truthfully was consistent with democratic values that should be supported by anyone who benefited from free press coverage of their own activities and achievements. The specific examples that Ronaldo provided about Palestinian journalists who had been killed, imprisoned, or prevented from working revealed his detailed knowledge about press freedom violations that extended far beyond general awareness of Middle Eastern conflicts, and his ability to name specific cases and describe particular challenges faced by Palestinian media professionals demonstrated that his support was based on research and understanding rather than superficial sympathy that might be easily dismissed as uninformed celebrity activism that lacked substance or genuine commitment to the causes being advocated through public statements and media appearances. Layla's visible emotion as Ronaldo spoke about the dangers faced by her colleagues revealed both her appreciation for his support and her recognition that having a global platform advocate for Palestinian journalists could provide protection and visibility that might reduce threats and create opportunities for Palestinian media professionals to participate more fully in international journalism, where their perspectives and expertise could contribute to more comprehensive coverage of events and issues that affected their communities and the broader region where conflicts generated enormous international attention, but rarely included Palestinian voices in meaningful ways. The commitment that Ronaldo made during the press conference extended beyond general statements of support to specific promises about using his platform to advocate for journalist safety, supporting organizations that provided legal assistance and protection for Palestinian media professionals, and ensuring that Palestinian journalists were included in future press events and media opportunities where their participation could help diversify coverage while providing platforms for voices that were often excluded from international media discussions about sports, politics, and culture in ways that reinforce stereotypes and misconceptions, rather than providing accurate information about Palestinian society and experiences. The Foundation initiative that emerged from this press conference focused on supporting press freedom and journalist safety throughout conflict zones and regions where media professionals faced persecution for reporting truthfully about government actions, civilian conditions, and human rights violations that some authorities preferred to keep hidden from international scrutiny that might generate criticism and pressure for policy changes. And the initiative's work included providing legal assistance, safety training, equipment, and advocacy that helped journalists continue their essential work despite threats and obstacles that were designed to silence voices that challenged official narratives or documented systematic problems. The international media coverage that followed the press conference focused initially on Ronaldo's unusual willingness to discuss political topics in a sports context, but a deeper story that emerged was about the systematic exclusion of Palestinian voices from international media platforms and the ways that celebrity advocacy could create opportunities for marginalized journalists whose perspectives were essential for comprehensive understanding of conflicts and issues that affected millions of people whose stories were rarely told with the detail and empathy they deserved from international audiences, who might otherwise remain ignorant about conditions and policies that violated human rights and democratic principles. The policy impact of Ronaldo's advocacy included increased attention to press freedom violations in occupied territories, pressure on international sports organizations to ensure that Palestinian journalists could access events and cover stories without discrimination or harassment, and support for initiatives that provided training and resources for Palestinian media professionals whose work was essential for documenting conditions and events that might otherwise remain unknown to international audiences who needed accurate information to make informed decisions about policies and relationships that affected Palestinian communities and the broader region. Years later, when several Palestinian journalists had gained international recognition partly through opportunities created by advocacy efforts that Ronaldo had supported, when press freedom organizations had established programs specifically designed to protect media professionals working in occupied territories, when international media coverage of Palestinian issues had become more comprehensive and accurate, due partly to increased access for Palestinian reporters whose perspectives had previously been excluded from major platforms, Ronaldo would reflect that defending Lila and her colleagues at that press conference had been one of the most important moments of his career, because it had demonstrated that celebrity platforms could be used to amplify voices that were being systematically silenced, that sports figures had responsibilities to address human rights issues that affected people in their global audiences, and that press freedom was essential for democratic societies that depended on accurate information and diverse perspectives to make decisions about policies and relationships that affected millions of people whose stories deserve to be told with honesty and respect, rather than being filtered through official narratives that obscured truth in service of political convenience.